Tonight, we're peeling back the linen on a truth you were never meant to see. Not the Hollywood pharaohs, not the museum glass, not the glossy myths told with a smile. We're descending into a world where the dead were not buried to rest, but to prepare for judgment, a world where your tongue was wrapped in spells, your heart could testify against you, and one wrong breath could doom your soul for eternity. This isn't just history. This is a system older than empires, built to protect the dead from the gods and the living from the dead. And if you think mummies were just spooky Halloween stories, you're about to learn why the Egyptians didn't fear death. They feared getting it wrong. Now, lie back, close your eyes, and listen carefully. The ritual is about to begin. You arrive not with footsteps, but with breath. A slow inhale beneath a moon that hangs swollen and yellow over the horizon like a watching eye. The desert has long since stilled. The wind no longer moves. Even the stars seem reluctant to twinkle here, as though they, too, hold their breath in this sacred silence. You stand at the edge of something older than history, more ancient than any language you know. A mouth in the sand yawns open before you, framed by stone teeth, worn soft by time and dust. A forgotten tomb whose breath you now disturb. You don't speak. The desert is not a place for words. It is a place for listening. And so you do, to the hush, to the faintest crunch of sand under your soles, to the sound your own heart makes when the world is otherwise mute. It is not fear you feel, not exactly. It is awe, that cousin of fear, dressed in reverence, cloaked in curiosity. You step forward, not because you must, but because the pull is too gentle and too strong to ignore. A pull older than you, older than nations, the pull of death's ritual. The stone corridor receives you with warmth, not living warmth, but the retained heat of long dead days. It wraps around your shoulders like an old linen shroud, thin but persistent. You run your fingertips along the chiseled wall, and though you cannot read the script, your skin recognizes meaning in the grooves. These are not mere decorations. These are instructions, etched prayers, warnings perhaps, for the dead and for those who dare trespass. But you are not here to trespass. You're here to witness. The torch you carry is small and trembling. Its flame shivers, as if nervous to light the way. And yet it burns, catching flecks of gold embedded in the painted plaster, igniting sparks in the staring eyes of painted gods Horus, jackal-faced Anubis, the towering Osiris with skin the color of rebirth. They do not smile, they do not blink, but you feel seen, not judged, but noted, as one might mentally jot down a name, a presence, a disturbance in the sacred air. With each step, the world you came from, the one with asphalt, emails, and ticking clocks melts behind you like dew in the sand. Here, time unravels. The walls narrow, forcing you to bow your head in passage, whether for space or for respect. It hardly matters now. You bow, you inhale. The scent of something bitter and beautiful clings to the air resin. Old smoke, faint decay sweetened by cedar and frankincense. You reach a chamber, not large, not yet, just a vestibule of sorts, a place where the air stops and listens. The silence here is shaped, structured, not accidental. It's as if the very space was built to muffle sound, to trap it, hold it, teach it patience. The echo of your breath feels like a blasphemy, so you pause, you let the hush settle, and it welcomes you in return. There's a statue near the far wall, not tall, not imposing, but precise. A woman with the throne of Isis atop her head and arms raised not in warning, but invitation. She holds a waz scepter in one hand and what might be a crook in the other, tools of comfort and control. Her eyes are black stones, polished to an unreasonable shine. You meet her gaze for a moment too long and feel the peculiar sensation that she's asking a question, though you cannot hear it. Behind her, a doorway, sealed once by limestone, now broken just wide enough to squeeze through. You do, because this is what you came for. The truth wrapped not in mystery, but in cloth, layer upon layer of linen and intention. The story not of a body, but of what it meant to preserve one. You crouch into the next corridor. It dips downward. The air thickens. The silence grows teeth. You can taste its patience now. It has been waiting a very long time for someone to listen, not to rush, not to conquer, but to be still, to understand. It is not lost on you that this place was made not for the dead, but for the transformation of the dead. Every surface, every alcove, every grain of pigment on the wall whispers that this was never meant to be a grave. It is a doorway, a system, a ritual in stone, a machine not of gears, but of gods and memory. A shift in the light draws your eye upward. There, on the arched ceiling, painted falcons fly in eternal orbit around a golden sun. Beneath them, a procession of figures, white robes, red stripes, shaved heads bowed low, carry something between them, a wrapped body, arms crossed, eyes closed. But this is not sadness. This is instruction. This is preparation. Your heart slows. Even your thoughts begin to tread more softly. The world is quieter here, not just from absence of noise, but from the presence of intention. Everything here was made with such care that your own presence feels clumsy. You feel it in the slope of the floor, in the way the wall leans inward, not to collapse, but to cradle. You realize, slowly, that this tomb is not dead. It is dreaming, and you are walking through its dream. A whisper touches your shoulder. No sound, just the sensation of something almost like breath, though you are very much alone. Perhaps it is the tomb. Perhaps it is memory itself, stirring as you pass through it. There is no fear, only stillness, and something new beneath it, a question you haven't yet formed, but already feel will follow you long after you leave this place. Now, keep the deep breath and take one more step forward, deeper into the truth behind Egypt's tomb rituals. You descend deeper now, where the light no longer feels like a natural thing, but a borrowed one, and every flame you carry must behave as a guest, careful not to offend the darkness that owns this place. The air grows denser, touched by the scent of old resins, the faintest sting of natron still clinging to the walls, and something else unnameable, but ancient. You follow the curve of the passage as it leads you not toward a burial site, but toward a philosophy disguised in stone and ritual, a truth that burial was never just about the corpse. It began long before death came for the body. It began in the heart. It is one thing to lose a loved one, and another to prepare them to face gods. In ancient Egypt, mourning wasn't passive. It was structured, dictated, mapped by the stars, by scribes, by priests who spoke the language of eternity with a precision sharpened over centuries. But before anyone touched the linen, before a single finger was wrapped, before even the blood was drained or the jars set out, the first ritual happened within the living. It wasn't about grief. It was about alignment. You reach a small chamber where mural fragments cover the surrounding walls. They're cracked and faded, yet detailed enough to reveal a scene you can follow with your eyes like a script. A woman sits, motionless, hair cropped in mourning, hands pressed against her heart. Around her, no chaos, no wailing, only order. Behind her stand temple attendants measured, silent, purposeful. They are not here to comfort her. They are here to turn her sorrow into precision, because here, even emotion must be embalmed properly. And you realize this is the first wrapping, not of linen, but of thought. Grief must be structured. Love must be organized. The pain of death cannot be allowed to ripple uncontrolled into the world of the living. And so they began with silence, sacred silence, the kind that forces the chest to soften, the shoulders to drop, the voice to disappear until only breath remains. Even the decision to embalm wasn't made in haste. Not everyone was mummified. It was not merely a matter of class or status. It was a theological equation, a test of worth, a negotiation with the divine. One did not simply die and expect preservation. One had to be prepared psychologically, spiritually, ritually. There were scrolls to consult, auspicious days to count, calendars of both sky and tomb to align. The afterlife was not a reward, it was a task, and only those who knew how to begin the work before death could hope to complete it after. You step forward and find a broken slab on the ground, half buried in dust, etched with lines of hieratic text, a funerary decree, but not for the dead, for the family. It demands offerings, not flowers, but labor, time, devotion, to be given not once, but repeatedly, ritually, annually. Grief in ancient Egypt was not something to survive. It was something to repeat, to inscribe into habit, to discipline into legacy. The first wrapping of the dead was the wrapping of memory, of duty, of repetition that kept the soul's name and anchored in the world of the living. They called it Heka magic, but not the kind with wands or tricks. Heka was action, ordered action. Every movement, every utterance, every placement of a stone or pouring of oil was part of a code that shaped the outcome of the soul's journey. To weep in disarray was dangerous. To bury hastily was unwise. The dead could become trapped, or worse, restless. And so they wrapped not only bodies, but intentions. You imagine it now. A family seated in silence, before the body is even prepared, before a single jar is lifted, their heads bowed, each person assigned a role. Who will wash the hands? Who will recite the names of ancestors? Who will fast for purification? Who will carry the bay spells on strips of papyrus that must be placed under the tongue or between the fingers? These choices are not ceremonial. They are consequential, because the gods are not fooled by appearances. They peer deeper, past linen, past gold, past the carved promises, into what lived in the hearts of the ones who performed the rites. You find a painted niche in the wall barely wider than your palm. Inside, a figure no larger than your thumb, a tiny carved Shabdi figure, arms crossed, holding farming tools. It's a servant for the afterlife, but it is not placed here for the dead alone. It's for the living, too. A reminder that work never ends, not even after death, and that devotion must continue on both sides of the veil. The first wrapping, you understand now, was about control. Death was too vast, too unpredictable to be left untethered. So they bound it in intention. They wrapped the unknown in ritual. They mummified chaos itself by laying out 1,000 steps of order, turning mystery into method, turning grief into a ritual so exacting it became sacred. And in doing so, they weren't just preserving the dead, they were preserving themselves. You sit now, briefly, against the cool wall of the passage, letting your hand rest on the carved sandstone. It is smooth in places, etched in others, but everywhere it bears the fingerprints of those who came before you: priests, scribes, mourners, artists, devotees, each one with their own version of the same question: how do we carry someone into eternity without losing ourselves in the process? The answer, for them, was to begin early, to begin before death, to prepare not just a tomb, but a memory strong enough to carry through time. You look ahead into the deeper dark, knowing the embalming table awaits somewhere beyond. But for now, you sit in the company of that first quiet, the wrapping not of cloth, but of thought. And as your breath slows, you realize the journey into the tomb is not about decay. It's about what endures. You rise slowly, brushing fine sand from your robe, the silence folding around you again like a second skin. What comes next is no longer abstract, no longer ceremonial in the quiet philosophical way that grief is. What waits for you beyond this next passage is tactile. It stains stone, it leaves scent, it stains memory. You pass under a low beam carved with the eye of Horus, a symbol of healing, yes, but also of wholeness regained only after breaking. Beyond it lies the room where the transformation truly begins, not with linen, not yet, but with undoing the body's hold on life. This chamber is colder. The stone beneath your feet carries a heaviness, a residue, as if time itself had congealed into the floor, seeped into the pores of every tool, every table, every basin. In the center lies a stone slab angled slightly, chiseled with rivulets to direct the flow of what once pulsed with life. The slab is both altar and operating table, and here the line between devotion and dissection becomes beautifully, terribly blurred. The embalmers were not butchers, though they wielded knives. They were not physicians, though they opened flesh with great care. They were something more precise ritual engineers. They did not merely work on the dead, they translated them, turning fragile, rotting matter into something the gods might still recognize. You look upon the jars, 4 of them, seated like sentinels along the chamber's ledge. Each is sealed with a different head: a baboon, a jackal, a falcon, a human. These are the sons of Horus, and each holds not a symbol, but an actual part of the deceased's body. You may be tempted to see this as grotesque, but to an ancient Egyptian, it was as necessary as breath. To remove the organs was not mutilation, it was preservation. The body decays from the inside out. To save a person, you must begin by unmaking them. First, the liver warm, fatty, vital, taken out and handed to Imsidi, the human-headed jar, guardian of its memory. Then the stomach, delivered to Duamutef, the jackal-headed protector. The lungs, light and wet, go to Hapi, the baboon-headed watcher. And last, the intestines, twisted and dangerous, claimed by Kabesanuef, the falcon-headed soul. The heart, strangely, was sometimes removed then returned. It depended on the priest, on the era, on the perceived worth of the individual. But the brain that was almost always discarded. You pause at that. The seat of thought, of personality, of memory, removed with a hooked tool through the nose, liquefied and drained out in pieces. It was not needed. It had no place in the next world. The Egyptians believed thought lived in the heart, that the mind was simply an echo chamber, and so the brain was thrown away, often fed to birds. You imagine the sound of that hook entering the nasal cavity. You imagine what it would mean to watch your loved one's face cave in, knowing it is part of their rebirth. And still, this was done in reverence. You step closer to the tools themselves. They are laid neatly on a flat stone, bronze scalpels, obsidian blades, linen-wrapped tongs. They rest as if awaiting their next rite. But their presence whispers a deeper truth. The embalmers were not just handlers of death, they were also secret keepers. In ancient Egypt, the body was sacred, and to touch it after death required not just skill, but ritual insulation. Embalmers wore masks not to hide their identity, but to mark themselves as vessels of the divine. Their work was so delicate, so spiritually loaded, that it became taboo outside the walls of this preparation chamber. In fact, those who performed the incisions were sometimes ritually chased and symbolically beaten once the body was sealed, not in anger, but to cleanse the ritual of its violence. You run a hand along the base of the slab and notice the faint groove where thousands of bodies have drained over centuries. Salt, resin, blood, bile. These are not the fluids of horror. Here, they are ingredients in an alchemical pursuit, deconstruction, in service of resurrection. To embalm someone was to declare, boldly, that the body still mattered. In so many other cultures, death demanded abandonment of the flesh, ashes, decay, emptiness. But here, the body was a map, a key, a double of the soul. It had to be rendered incorruptible, not only to preserve identity, but to fool the spirits who fed on rot, the demons of decay, the gods of the threshold. They could smell a lie, a flaw, a tear in the wrong direction, and so the embalmers became perfectionists, artists whose medium was mortality. You find a small inscription on the far wall, chipped but legible. It is not grand, not gilded, just a few lines, a prayer spoken by the embalmer as he begins, "I have not wept, I have not faltered, my hands are steady, my soul is clean. I do this in silence, that you may rise in speech." You close your eyes and let those words settle inside you. There is an eerie serenity in this place. Not dread, not gore, just a profound sense of labor sacred, repetitive, essential. These rituals were not done in fear of death, but in service to life continued. The removal of organs was not desecration. It was storage, insurance, a belief that the soul, when reawakened, would return to its house, recognize its chambers, and know that it had been cared for in absence. You think of how death is treated in the world, you know, hidden behind curtains, spoken of in hushed euphemisms, dealt with in brief, impersonal moments. Here, death was a collaboration, a relationship, a task that involved not just the one who died, but the entire community. One death was never singular. It required many hands, many days, many offerings. You walk once more around the slab, slowly now, as if orbiting a planet. You imagine the weight of each gesture, the ritual washing, the salting of the body with natron, until every droplet of moisture was pulled out like a whisper, leaving behind something that resembled death, but was not decay. Then the wrapping could begin, but not yet. First, the body must dry. For 40 days, in silent chambers surrounded by offerings and incense. 40 days to strip away the corruption. 40 days to make the body hollow enough to hold the divine. You trace your finger along the rim of one canopic jar. The seal is unbroken, the contents still held, and somewhere, whether in history, in spirit, or in memory, a name is still being carried forward, because this ritual was done correctly, because someone took the time to remove what could rot and keep what could last. And you realize, with a quiet chill and a deeper respect, that mummification was never just about stopping death. It was about perfecting a version of the person that would never change again. A final edition, salted, drained, stolen from time itself. The light shifts as you leave the embalming chamber behind. Not brighter, but different, thinner, more reflective. The walls of the next passage shimmer faintly beneath your torch, dusted with flecks of gold embedded in pigment long since darkened. By centuries of incense smoke and desert breath, you've entered the place of becoming, not the becoming of body, but of identity, where the face of the dead was not remembered but reconstructed, shaped, layered, perfected, until it became something more powerful than memory. It became illusion. And illusion, in this sacred place, was not deception. It was protection. You arrive in front of a platform, lower than the embalming slab, but more ornate. Above it, a painted arch depicts the weighing of the heart, Anubis guiding the scale, Thoth taking notes, Ammit crouched nearby, her lion hippopotamus jaws ready to devour any heart heavier than the feather of truth. This was no metaphor to the ancient Egyptian. It was law, divine, unavoidable, and in order to face that judgment, the soul needed more than purity. It needed armor, and so they fashioned it, a mask. You lean closer to the display at the center of the chamber. It isn't the famous mask you know from museums and documentaries, not the glittering face of Tutankhamun, but a simpler one, cracked and flaked, still luminous despite its decay. The gold leaf, though worn, clings to its contours, and beneath it, faint traces of blue enamel still glimmer around the eyes and brows. It is delicate, not imposing, and yet it radiates presence because it was never made to look like the deceased. It was made to look like someone the gods would recognize, or perhaps not recognize at all. You trace your eyes along the contours of the cheeks, the lips, the faint smile pressed into permanence. This mask was not a likeness. It was a statement, a declaration that the person beneath it had crossed into something greater. The features were standardized, divine, symmetry mattered, color mattered. The golden face signified flesh of the gods. The inlaid eyes declared eternal vigilance. The lapis outlines suggested power and rebirth, not sadness or rest. To be buried without a mask was to face the afterlife naked, vulnerable to accusation, to forgetting. But with it, you could become more than yourself. You could become Osiris, the god who died and rose. Every mummy, in some way, became him, and so every mask bore not just human intention, but divine narrative. You kneel before a set of tools, arranged carefully on a nearby shelf. Small chisels, bone spatulas, brushes hardened with time. These are not the tools of morticians. They are the instruments of theater, of alchemy. The mask was not simply placed. It was formed, sculpted in layers, from linen and plaster, resin and paint, gold and charm. It was fitted, then bound. The illusion had to hold not just in the tomb, but in the spirit world. It had to deceive not only decay, but the gods themselves, because here lies the secret beneath the reverence, beneath the divine poetry. There was fear, fear that the soul might be judged unworthy, that a single flaw, a single lie left exposed, would tip the scale and doom the heart to oblivion. And so the mask didn't just hide the face, it spoke in the face's place. It made promises the deceased might never have dared in life. I have not stolen, the mask declared through spells written beneath it. I have not lied. I have not spilled blood. I am pure. I am ready. You notice, then, that the mask is not alone. There are scrolls beside it, fragments of papyri tucked into the crevices of the chamber, some sealed into tiny bundles of linen, others scrawled in red and black ink. These are the chapters of the Book of the Dead, or more precisely, the book of going forth by day. They are not stories, they are instructions, scripts to be recited, proof of moral cleanliness, manuals for rebirth, and many of them were meant to be whispered not by the soul, but by the mask. And yet, there is something tragic in this perfection. The person behind the mask, the actual human being, with flawed choices, fleeting joys, stuttering regrets, was lost beneath the performance. What remained was what they hoped the gods would see, not what they truly were. And you wonder, gently, if perhaps that's always been true of masks. In every culture, in every time, you sit on the edge of the platform and let the space settle around you. The air is warm here, stale but gentle, like the breath of something sleeping. You think about the way humans strive to be remembered. We carve our names into wood, stitch them into uniforms, post them online, etch them into granite. But the Egyptians, at least here, they sculpted their memory into ideal form, knowing that to be remembered was not enough. One had to be remembered correctly. But who defines correctness? The gods, the priests, the mask. You imagine yourself lying on this slab, your body already dried, emptied, wrapped in spells and linens. What version of your face would you offer the next world? What version would you want judged? Not the one worn during a difficult year, not the one shaped by mistakes, but the one closest to your hopes, your yearning. That, perhaps, is what the mask truly was, a final attempt to be seen, not for what you were, but for what you were becoming. You stand now, quietly, and pass a painted panel on the exit wall. It shows a soul ascending, arms raised toward the stars, with the mask still shining on its face, unbroken, unblinking. It is not a corpse anymore. It is light, direction, a symbol, carried into the realm of gods. As you move forward, deeper into the tomb's winding halls, you carry with you the silence of that mask, not cold, not deceptive, but deeply human. Because maybe the greatest lie we tell the gods is not that we were perfect. Maybe it's that we ever stopped trying to be. You continue through the narrow corridor, feeling its smooth embrace on either side, the stone brushing faintly against your shoulders like an old friend guiding you somewhere it thinks you need to be. The passage curves slightly, a graceful bend that leads you not toward grandeur, but toward meticulousness, a chamber smaller than those before, more intimate in its scale, but no less profound. It is here, not in the grand halls of burial or the painted ceilings of gods, that you begin to understand the full weight of Egypt's obsession with completeness. There's a stillness in this room that feels different, not silence, not death, but something like focus, as though the very dust has paused midair, unsure whether to settle. Your torch flickers against the walls, revealing shelves lined with delicate relics, tiny amulets shaped like eyes, beetles, miniature limbs, feathers, and sacred knots. They are arranged with obsessive care, and for good reason. This was the chamber where the dead were assembled piece by piece, finger by finger, toe by toe, not just for burial, but for spiritual cohesion. You approach a low table at the center. It holds what looks like a pair of feet, bound tightly in linen, each toe individually wrapped, adorned with gold-tipped caps shaped like lotus buds. You had seen wrapping before, but this is different. This isn't preservation. This is inventory, a declaration that nothing has been forgotten, not even the smallest, most perishable part of the human form. Because to the ancient Egyptian, to lose a toe, a finger, a bit of skin, even in death, was to risk entering the afterlife incomplete, and incompleteness was perilous. The gods could reject you, the soul could become confused, fragmented, unable to recognize itself as whole. It wasn't enough to look human. One had to be whole ritually, spiritually, anatomically, and so every joint, every eyelid, every strand of hair was counted, wrapped, labeled in the secret language of charms and gestures. If a piece had decayed or been damaged before death, it was not ignored. It was reimagined, carved from wax, molded from linen and plaster, whispered over with incantations to be accepted as the real thing in the eyes of the divine. You pause before a series of tiny painted wooden boxes stacked along the eastern wall. Each bears the name of a body part, one for fingers, one for toes, one for the tongue, one, even, for the heart's shadow. You understand then that this was not superstition. It was memory formalized, a way to keep the soul from becoming confused as it traveled through the labyrinth of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The dead needed to know themselves to recognize every inch of their being as part of a unity, a name, an identity with weight. On the far wall, a mural shows the work in action. A priest, masked as Anubis, leans over a mummy in progress. His hands are precise, steady, reverent. Each finger of the corpse is being wrapped with its own strip of linen, each one painted with protective spells and the symbol of the Ankh, the breath of life. There's no haste, no corner cutting. The painting captures a ritual that might take days, even weeks, not out of extravagance, but necessity. If even a single digit was missed, the entire resurrection could fail. You find an open scroll on a stone shelf, its fibers delicate but surprisingly intact. The text lists the 42 negative confessions, ancient declarations of purity, one for each judge the soul would face in the afterlife. I have not stolen, I have not slandered, I have not eaten forbidden things. The list goes on, but alongside each line is a drawing of a body part, as if the judgment itself was conducted not by spirit alone, but by the body's parts in concert. Each finger had to speak its innocence. Each eye had to declare that it had not seen evil. Each ear had to proclaim it had not heard lies. This, then, was the purpose of such detailed preservation. It was not vanity, it was testimony. You kneel beside a linen bundle that's been partially unraveled. Inside is a resin-hardened hand, its fingers curled slightly, as though still clinging to a final gesture. Around it are scarab charms and a miniature Shin ring symbols of eternity and protection. But the most telling item is a thin strip of papyrus slipped between the fingers, covered in tightly inked script. It is a prayer, yes, but not to the gods. It is to the hand itself, an instruction, a plea that it might remember its function, that it might lift again when called upon in the hall of truth, that it might recognize its place in the whole. This obsession with completeness was not rooted in arrogance. It was born of a belief that the body was not a husk to be discarded, but a sacred map to be followed. To be whole was not to be beautiful, but to be legible to yourself, to the gods, to the universe beyond. And yet, as you sit with this realization, something softer rises beneath the reverence, something profoundly human. You think of the modern rituals we perform folding clothes for the dead, brushing their hair, kissing the forehead one last time. Aren't we, in our own quiet way, still trying to keep them together, still resisting the idea that they might dissolve into pieces we can't find? You reach out and gently place your hand over the preserved one. The linen is cool, firm, dry, but there is something electric in the gesture, something older than fear and deeper than memory. You're not just touching a fragment of a person, you're touching an act of devotion so precise, so complete, it dared to defy decay itself. And as you rise once more, you understand with sudden clarity that mummification was not a defense against death. It was a refusal to be forgotten in pieces, because the gods were watching, and so were the ancestors, and the person beneath the wrappings deserved to arrive whole, ready, prepared to raise their hands, one finger at a time, and say, "I am still here." You move deeper still, and with each step, the quiet becomes not heavier, but denser, layered, no longer a singular silence, but one made of many smaller hushes, stacked one atop another, like folds of cloth laid precisely across a still chest. The corridor narrows once more, and when you pass beneath the carved archway that marks the threshold into the next chamber, you feel it. The air has changed, not in scent or weight, but in intention. You have entered the room where the dead were dressed, and not in finery, not in fabrics of vanity or display, but in language hidden, spoken, sacred. At the center of the chamber lies a form, long and silent, beneath a translucent linen canopy. It is not a real body, but a replica placed for ritual, a training form for apprentices, a vessel used to rehearse the precision of wrapping, not to preserve flesh, but to remember words. Because what you will learn here is that mummification was not simply a process of covering, it was an incantation in motion. Linen, in this space, is not passive. It is not a mere container. Each strip, each fold, each layer carried with it a spell written on its surface, whispered as it was applied, repeated with a rhythm that echoed both breath and eternity. To wrap the dead was not to hide them. It was to arm them, insulate them, encode them in language they could carry past death. Without these words, the afterlife would be deaf to them. The gods would not listen. The doorways would not open. You kneel beside a bundle of prepared linens. They are aged now, brittle at the corners, discolored from resin and time, but still recognizable in their sequence. One for the feet, one for the thighs, another for the arms, crossed at the chest. The layers were not randomly chosen. They followed a sacred geometry, a choreography passed down across generations. And more than this, between certain layers, the priests would insert thin slivers of papyrus or linen painted with symbols, the eye of Horus for healing, the scarab for rebirth, the Djed pillar for stability, the Shin ring for eternity. These were not just decorations, they were passwords. You examine one now, a small talisman stitched into the wrap just above where the throat would be. It bears a prayer not of farewell, but of command. Let my voice be heard in the hall of Maad. Let my tongue speak truth, even when my mouth is closed. And it strikes you not only as the body being preserved, but its rights, its voice, its agency, in a world where silence might mean erasure. These spells were guarantees that even the voiceless could still be heard. You rise slowly and turn to the painted wall panels. Here, the act of wrapping is rendered in soft reds and ochres, with priests and priestesses in long robes, each holding a roll of linen or a censer of incense. The one closest to the head wears a mask of Anubis, his black snout turned downward, hands raised in blessing. He is mid-gesture, his arms caught in a motion that seems both tender and exacting. This is not the stroke of grief, it is the stroke of intention. Each piece of cloth is a verse. Each crossing of the fabric is a sentence binding the body to the world that waits beyond. You notice the space is fragrant, not overpoweringly so, but subtly layered frankincense, cedarwood, and a bitter myrrh that clings to the tongue of the air. These scents were not chosen arbitrarily. They were preservatives, yes, but also purifiers, symbols of the divine breath. As each strip of linen was applied, incense was burned not just to mask the scent of decay, but to summon the sacred into the space, to remind the living that they stood in both a tomb and a temple, and the wrapping itself could take days, sometimes over 2 full months, depending on the wealth and complexity of the person being prepared. Each joint, each digit, each curve and hollow required specific language. When the priests wrapped the fingers, they recited the spell of grasp. When they wrapped the arms, they spoke of embrace, of reunion with loved ones in the field of reeds. When they wrapped the legs, they invoked the journey safe steps through the duat. Even the wrapping of the back included invocations to defend against those who would attack from behind spirits, demons, forgotten enemies. You sit beside the replica form and place your hand gently on its chest. You feel the firmness of the layers beneath your palm, cloth upon cloth, word upon word. It feels dense, like scripture made physical, and it occurs to you that the body, once feared to be ephemeral, has here become a tablet, a sacred scroll written not with ink alone, but with touch. There's a passage from a funerary text you recall now, often quoted by embalmers during this part of the ritual. My body is the body of Osiris. My limbs are the limbs of Horus. My words are the words of Thoth. I am not dead. I am prepared. And that final word prepared echoes in your mind because it changes everything. Death, in this culture, was not an end. It was a transition, and to transition correctly, one had to be fluent. One had to be dressed not just in linens, but in language. You look again at the form and imagine someone you've loved in its place. The idea is difficult, tender, strange, and yet something about it is comforting. To think of them so carefully wrapped, not just to preserve their form, but to give them strength, protection, voice, not abandoned to rot, but readied for return. And suddenly, the silence in this room no longer feels like absence. It feels like recitation, a hum beneath the walls, beneath the breath, beneath even the dust, as if somewhere the words are still being spoken, the bindings still being tied, the journey still being prepared, one sacred sentence at a time. You rise. You nod once to the figure in repose, and as you move toward the next chamber, you understand that what holds a person together after death is not muscle, not sinew, not even bone. It is story, and it is spells, woven, word by word, into every inch of who they were and who they hope to become. You walk slowly now, not just because of the narrowing of the corridor, but because the weight of what you've seen, heard, and imagined is beginning to settle differently in your chest. You're no longer merely descending into a tomb. You are navigating a philosophy, a cosmology, where every gesture toward the dead is a conversation, every symbol a sentence, every object placed beside the body a form of dialogue that must endure long after breath is gone. You enter the next chamber, and here the silence feels heavier again, but not oppressive. It's more like the hush inside a place where something is being spoken in a tongue you haven't yet learned to hear. The chamber is arranged in a square, perfectly symmetrical, with 4 niches carved into the walls, each holding a lidded jar resting upon a small stone pedestal. You know what they are before your torch reaches them. the canopic jars, but they are more than containers. Much more. They are guardians, witnesses, keepers of stories the body can no longer tell for itself. You approach the first. The jar is made of alabaster, creamy and soft in its glow, its lid shaped like the head of a human man, Imsity, guardian of the liver. His face is serene, lips pressed into a knowing stillness, eyes painted in coal lines that seem to follow you with impossible gentleness. The liver, in the ancient view, was more than an organ. It was the seat of emotion, the processing center of internal heat, of generosity, of anger, of courage. To entrust it to Imsity was to ensure the heart would not wander off without its companion. To place it here was to say this part of me still matters. Even after death, even beyond use. You turn to the next jar, darker in hue, the stone flecked with veins of crimson and rust. Its lid bears the jackal head of Duamutef, the guardian of the stomach. His ears are alert, his snout elongated, gaze sharp yet composed. The stomach was believed to house desire, hunger, even longing, and so Duamutef stood watch over it, not to eliminate those feelings, but to refine them, to prepare them for a realm where nothing physical could be consumed, but where the soul still craved memory, companionship, purpose. The third jar rests in shadow until you lift your torch. It reflects no light, only drinks it. The lid bears the head of a baboon hapi, the protector of the lungs. You pause before him longer than the others. There's something in the tilt of his painted head, in the slight asymmetry of his carved mouth, that suggests he's not entirely at rest. The lungs, the breath, the inhale and exhale that separate life from death. Hapi guards that rhythm now, keeping it in the silence, keeping it in the stillness. And perhaps, you think, he listens to each breath we take above ground, waiting for the final one, before he calls us back to remember what it meant to breathe. And finally, the last jar, the smallest, but in many ways the most watchful, the falcon-headed Kibasenuef, guardian of the intestines. To us, these might seem insignificant, fragile, winding, difficult to map, but to the Egyptians, they held vitality, transformation, the strange alchemy of digestion. They were seen as the inner labyrinth, and who better to guard a labyrinth than a falcon, sharp-eyed, divine, capable of flight and focus alike. Together, the four jars do not just contain, they converse. They anchor the soul's components in place, not merely to keep them from decay, but to ensure they remain loyal to the person they belonged to the life they left, to the gods they will now face. Each jar, in essence, carries a different piece of you, but none of them are silent. You step back and notice that each pedestal has writing beneath it, short texts, prayers, fragments from funerary scrolls. These were not inscriptions for show. They were meant to be read aloud, over and over, by priests, by family members, even by the deceased if the soul wandered back through the tomb. The canopic jars were not sealed to be forgotten. They were part of a relationship. They were spoken to. You kneel at the center of the room, surrounded by the four guardians, and you begin to realize what this geometry means. The body, after being emptied, was not simply closed. It was distributed carefully, ritually, respectfully, and each part was given its own keeper, its own identity, its own destiny. To the ancient mind, we are not one thing, we are many, a constellation of parts, each with its own resonance. And so the jars became like satellites, orbiting the wrapped body, echoing its existence, even after the flesh had been made mute. You look up to the ceiling, and painted there is a circular pattern, 4 figures, arms outstretched, connected by ribbons of stars, encircling a central glyph of the Ankh, life, eternal, balanced. These were not accidents of design. The tomb was engineered to mirror the soul's fragmentation and reassembly. What was taken apart had to be given form again, not in the same shape, but in harmony. The jars, like the fingers and toes, were not merely biological keepsakes. They were mnemonic devices for the soul, physical reminders of what it meant to be whole in a world where wholeness could be so easily lost. A voice enters your mind, not a literal voice, but the echo of a translated text you once read, a passage from an embalmer's scroll when I return. May each jar speak for me. May Imsidi recall my kindness. May Dua Mutef guard my hunger. May Hapi remember my breath. May Keba Senuef hold fast to my path. You whisper the lines softly, your voice barely a breath, and for a moment, the silence in the room feels different, not expectant, but satisfied, like the last word of a conversation you didn't know you'd started. As you stand to leave the chamber, you do not feel watched, you feel accompanied, and perhaps, in the long quiet between death and whatever comes next, that's all anyone can ask for, that someone or something holds your name, your breath, your longing, your courage, and refuses to forget. You pass once more between the guardians, and the thought settles gently in your mind. You are not preserved by cloth or resin or even prayer. You are preserved by relationship between self and body, between parts and purpose, between silence and remembrance. The passage ahead widens gradually, opening not into grandeur, but into consequence. There is a stillness here, unlike the hush of previous chambers. This is not the silence of respect or ritual. It is the kind of pause the world takes before something irreversible. The torch in your hand dances across smooth walls, etched with meticulous carvings, lines of sacred text so dense they seem to form a net designed not to capture your body, but your fate. You're entering a place where the purpose of burial was never closure. It was commencement. The chamber you now face is deeper, colder, and shaped with a geometry that suggests more than function. This was a portal, and every surface, every object within it, was placed to prepare the soul for its first true reckoning, not with decay, but with judgment. The outer rituals, the wrapping, the prayers, the preserving of organs were never ends in themselves. They were rehearsals, preparatory acts leading to this singular truth death. In Egypt wasn't a finish line, it was an audition. And the gods, they weren't passive observers. They were the judges, the examiners of your ethical weight, the keepers of the scale. Your eyes adjust to the dim, and across from where you stand, a painted panel glows faintly in the dancing torchlight. It's the weighing of the heart, arguably the most iconic image in all of Egyptian funerary thought. But here, it feels freshly severe. Anubis is shown crouched beside a scale. On one side, the heart of the deceased. On the other, a feather, the symbol of Ma'at, goddess of truth and divine order. The heart must not be heavier than that single feather. Not metaphorically, literally. And no one was exempt from this law. Not kings, not priests, not scribes. And if the heart failed, if its weight betrayed a life of imbalance, then Ammit would be waiting. She, who was part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, a divine amalgamation of every creature that could end you in the Nile. She did not torture, she simply consumed, and that was far worse, because to be devoured by Ammit was to lose everything, not just your afterlife, but your name, your memory, your very right to have existed. You became untethered from all timelines. You vanished from even the idea of return. You step into the center of the room, and beneath your feet, you notice the faint outlines of a circle painted into the stone. This was the spot where the mummy would be placed on its final day within the tomb. Not to rest, but to undergo the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual designed to symbolically reawaken the senses. The priest would touch the lips of the wrapped figure with a ceremonial adze, not once, not casually, but with precise incantations, inviting the spirit to speak again, to breathe again, to become capable of declaring its own innocence when brought before the gods, because in this culture, even your silence could be judged. The murals around you now did shift from static panels to sequences like a storybook carved into stone. The soul, shown as a tiny bird with a human head, flits from one realm to another, approaching gates, facing tests. Each threshold is guarded by a different deity, and each one demands a password, a declaration, a justification. The soul must not simply pass through, it must explain why it deserves to. And these were not vague philosophical riddles. They were targeted. Have you stolen? Have you killed? Have you caused suffering when it could be avoided? The questions are precise, and the expected answers must be memorized long before death. There is no improvisation in the duat. This judgment was not an invention to comfort the grieving. It was law. It permeated Egyptian culture, shaping how people lived their daily lives. Ethical behavior wasn't framed in abstraction, it was necessity, because your afterlife depended on the echoes of your choices. Every word spoken, every action witnessed, every kindness performed or withheld. These things would weigh more than flesh ever could. You stop before a carved statue of Ma'at herself, her features serene, her feather crown rising gently from her brow. She is not fierce, she is not angry, but her gaze carries an immovable strength. Her justice is not vengeance, it is alignment. You feel her presence not as threat, but as certainty. Her existence says, if you are untrue, you will not pass, not because I punish, but because you cannot walk where order cannot go. Nearby lies a stone box, sealed with beeswax and twine, and resting beside it is a scribe's palette, its inkwells still faintly stained red and black. These belong to the priests, who would record the outcome of the heart's weighing. Not all souls passed, some were found wanting, and while no one would speak their names again, the priests would mark the event not to shame, but to remember the process. Because judgment, when done correctly, became its own kind of sanctity. You begin to understand why the earlier rituals were so exhaustive, why the wrapping, the spells, the careful preservation of the tongue and eyes, the protections around each toe, each organ, every single part of the person had to be made capable of testifying on their behalf. This wasn't ritual for the sake of comfort. This was legal preparation. Even the heart, if suspected of guilt, could be substituted. A heart scarab might be buried in its place, a carved talisman inscribed with a command that the heart not rise to betray its owner, not because it was evil, but because it remembered too much. The Egyptians knew the heart could tell inconvenient truths, and so, sometimes, it was silenced. You stand there, torch raised, and reflect on the strangeness of this belief that your own body might one day speak against you, that parts of you, once cherished, could become witnesses in a cosmic trial. And yet, in this belief, there is also dignity, because it means your life matters. Every hour, every glance, every mercy you offered. Nothing is lost, nothing is ignored. Even your mistakes are accounted for. And as you pass through the final arch of the chamber, leaving behind the feather, the scale, and the weight of divine scrutiny, a thought follows you like a soft breath. Burial is not rest, it is readiness. In this culture, you were not simply laid to sleep, you were laid to rise and to answer. The path begins to twist again, not in confusion, but in purpose. The walls close in, only slightly, forcing you to adjust your pace, your breath, your posture. There is no disorder in the narrowing. Everything here is shaped by deliberate thought, sacred geometry wrapped in stone and light. This is no crypt. This is not a space for mourning. This, you begin to realize, is architecture with an agenda. You are walking through a machine, not one of gears and metal, but of time, spirit, memory, and power, an intricate system designed not to contain the dead, but to transform them. You step into a room with no name, though its shape is unmistakably mechanical in function. It is octagonal, with grooves along the walls that once held movable panels, slots in the floor where objects could be positioned and shifted. There are holes in the ceiling, not accidental, not worn, but perfectly aligned to catch a shaft of sunlight at a specific time of year, one moment each season when the tomb was no longer silent, but alive with gold. This was not artistry for beauty's sake. This was ritual engineering. The tomb, in every element of its construction, was a resurrection engine. You kneel beside a long groove carved into the ground and run your hand through the fine, undisturbed dust within it. This was once a channel for liquid oils, resins, perhaps even water brought in during the funeral rites. Its slope is so subtle you almost miss it, but it leads to a basin at the center of the chamber, shaped like the Ankh, the symbol of life. And that's when the truth begins to settle. This place wasn't a static container for the dead. It was designed to function, to move, to respond to light, shadow, scent, and time. Every inch of the tomb had a task. Every surface held intention. The walls were calendars. The ceilings were maps of the stars. The floor plan was a guide for the K, the vital essence of a person, to move safely between dimensions. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was decorative. Even the painted goddess Isis, with her wings spread wide. Nephthys kneeling in mourning. Thoth recording with his ibis pen were more than icons. They were participants. Their images were activated by prayer, by breath, by the smoke of resin that once burned from copper censers, still faintly blackened at their bases. You study a mural of Osiris now. He stands, wrapped like the dead, skin green, eyes wide, flanked by hieroglyphs that hum with steady symmetry. But he is not trapped in stillness. There is movement in his posture, an echo of emergence. His scepter, the crook and flail, are angled precisely, not at random. When viewed under moonlight, their shadows would trace the axis between two star clusters, Orion and Sirius cosmic companions, believed to guide the soul of the pharaoh into the sky. And so the tomb, you understand now, was not just a place to bury Osiris. It was meant to turn the dead into him. You step forward and find a chamber within a chamber, smaller, circular, and ringed with stone ridges. This was a sound chamber, a place where chants would reverberate, where voices would bounce from one wall to another, amplifying and distorting until they felt like more than human. Here, the opening of the mouth ceremony was completed, but not once. It was repeated, echoed, magnified. The tomb itself became a resonator, Words spoken in its depths became larger than life. They were meant to be heard not just by gods, but by the very stones, the very air, and perhaps even by the dead. You pause beside a small alcove, carved with 3 shelves. Each one once held an object: a torch, a water jug, and a folded linen bundle. These were offerings for the Ba, the mobile soul. The Egyptians believed the soul had parts, some of which stayed in the tomb, others which roamed, gathering knowledge, checking on the living, traveling between this world and the next. The tomb was their launch pad, their nest, their embassy. If it was incomplete, misaligned, or rushed, the soul would wander confused, forgetful, even angry. That was the risk, not just death, but disorientation. You look upward and notice a rectangular cutout in the ceiling, too narrow to walk through, too precise to be random. This was the shaft, the symbolic throat of the tomb, leading toward the sky. When sealed, it could be opened once a year, aligned with a celestial event, a solstice, an equinox, or the heliacal rising of Sirius. On that day, the light would hit the face of the sarcophagus with direct clarity. For a brief moment, the dead would be reborn in light, and then it would pass. The tomb would close again, and wait. You run your hand along the edge of the shaft and feel the polish of wear. This was not accidental. This machine had been used maybe hundreds of times, for rituals long since forgotten. The burial was not the end. It was the first turning of the key, the first inhalation in a system built to breathe long after the lungs were stilled. You think of your own world now, of graves marked with names, dates, flowers that wilt, of mausoleums that stand in silence, untouched. You think of cremation, of urns, of the clean simplicity of endings. And then you compare it to this, a system built to do the opposite, to extend, to echo, to engage. The tomb here was not a wall against forgetting. It was a generator of remembrance. And this changes something in you, because the idea of death, often imagined as a closing door, begins to blur. What if it's not a shutting, but a shifting? What if the dead don't rest, so much as redirected through ritual, through design, through chambers like these, built not to say goodbye, but to say, we are not finished yet. As you move toward the final threshold of this chamber, you glance back, one last time, at the room's structure, its angles, its symbols, its precision, and it is beautiful. But more than that, it is functional. This wasn't a room. It was a spell, one made of stone, light, air, and memory. The moment you step beyond the boundary of the tomb's architectural heart, beyond its perfect symmetry, its silent gears of resurrection, something shifts. The air grows cooler, not in temperature, but in mood. It tightens, not from lack of space, but from the presence of something invisible, yet undeniably awake. You are no longer walking alone through the machinery of belief. You are entering a domain watched by memory itself. Here, the gods do not rest in murals or statues. They listen, they recall, they wait. This chamber is narrow but tall, its ceiling vanishing into shadows above your torch's reach. The walls are bare of color, but not of meaning. They're carved in deep relief rows upon rows of divine names, epithets, warnings, praises, each one etched by hand with obsessive care, each one a name not just of worship, but of accountability. Because in the Egyptian understanding of death, the gods were not distant, ornamental forces. They were auditors, watchers, recorders of every act you thought had disappeared into the dust of daily life. And they do not forget. You pause before a towering figure carved directly into the wall. It is not a full-bodied god, but a face Horus, falcon-eyed, his gaze unwavering, immortalized not in paint, but in depth, shadow, permanence. His eyes follow not just your movement, but your memory. This is the god who saw all from the sky, not just the victories, but the cowardice, not just the rituals, but the moments in between. And the Egyptians feared him not because he punished, but because he remembered. Across the chamber, a smaller figure crouches, feminine and fierce Sekhmet, the lioness, goddess of wrath and healing. She too was said to recall every broken promise, every imbalance, every action that disturbed Ma'at's order, and she did not forget quietly. She waited, she calibrated, and when the scale tipped too far, she acted not blindly, but with deliberate justice wrapped in flame. As you pass from one god to another, you begin to understand the true architecture of this place. It is not just stone, it is surveillance. Not the kind that spies from behind curtains or drips with suspicion, but the sacred kind. The kind that watches you simply because it loves the idea of truth too much to let it go unrecorded. You kneel before a low altar carved with the face of Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods. In his hands are scrolls, above his head a crescent moon, and etched beneath his feet are lines of hieratic script translated long ago. I write what you have done, not what you say, not what you believe, but what your hands have touched. There is something brutally honest in that, something deeply comforting as well. You are not judged for your intentions here. You are judged by your touch, your actions, your patterns, what you built, what you destroyed, what you preserved. You sit back, legs crossed beneath you, and let your torchlight flicker across the figures gathered around the perimeter. They are not arranged randomly. They are seated as if in a circle, and slowly, you realize this is a courtroom, not one of accusation, but of remembrance. The gods encircle the soul not to frighten it, but to recite it. They speak its name, its truth, its unedited self. They do not rely on the testimony of others. They need no witnesses. They are the witnesses. You touch the stone beneath you. It is cool and rough, carved with repeating symbols. The eye, the feather, the heart, the flame. These are not decorations. They are the essence of the judgment to come. They represent the balance each soul must maintain, not only after death, but in life. And you begin to understand why so much energy was poured into the construction of tombs. Because it was never about the dead forgetting the living. It was always about the gods refusing to forget the dead. In your world, memories fade. Names become soft echoes. The smallest choices, an unnoticed kindness, a whispered cruelty evaporate. But here, those moments are permanent, engraved into the divine mind. To the Egyptians, oblivion was not caused by time, but by disinterest, and the gods were never disinterested. They collected even your silences, even your failures to act. You feel the weight of this not as fear, but as recognition. You have been seen, you will be seen, and not just at your best. The gods remember your clumsiness, your doubt, your impulsive anger, but they also remember the second thought you had, the one that corrected it. They remember the moment you wanted to speak cruelty, but chose restraint. They remember not just your fall, but your reaching hand afterward. You stand and approach the far wall where a final panel sits, smaller than the rest. It shows a simple figure, not a god, not a priest, not a pharaoh, just a person, wrapped in linen, arms crossed, eyes closed. The gods surround this figure, each one touching a different point of the body, one at the heart, one at the lips, one at the feet. There is no crown, no gold, just the connection. This, the Egyptians believed, was the final moment before judgment. The gods would gather and remember the soul into being. They would not ask questions. They would not interrogate. They would simply know. And so, the tomb was designed to preserve more than a body. It was designed to preserve awareness, not only of the person's existence, but of their truth, their essence, their flaws and dignity, intertwined. The gods who refused to forget were not cruel for remembering. They were holy for doing so. And as you pass through this chamber, stepping once more into the shadows beyond, you realize that the deepest fear of death was not judgment, not pain, not even loss. It was the fear of being misremembered. Here, that fear had an answer. You will not be forgotten. Not by the gods, not by the walls, not by the silence you left behind. You descend further, and though the stone beneath your feet remains the same, something beneath it shifts an echo that no longer feels sacred, but suspicious, not solemn, but opportunistic. The air here is drier, still scented faintly with resin and dust, but threaded now with a different kind of memory, one that feels splintered, broken, unfinished. You're not in the heart of the tomb anymore. You've wandered into its wound. It doesn't announce itself with drama or destruction. There's no pile of bones or scattered jewelry to mark the violation. Instead, the damage here is quiet missing fragments on the murals, gouges in stonework, sealed niches pried open with carelessness disguised as urgency. And you realize, slowly, that you are standing in the aftermath of something ancient, an ongoing theft, desecration, the ritual of robbing the dead. But this, too, was part of the story, because as much as the Egyptians feared judgment by the gods, they also feared judgment by their fellow man, and history that tells us that even the most sacred tombs, wrapped in protections and prayers, eventually found themselves at the mercy of greed. It's tempting to imagine the tomb robbers as shadows, faceless thieves, slipping in by moonlight, with only malice in their hearts. But the truth, like everything else here, is more complex. These robbers were often desperate. Sometimes they were even the very same workers who built the tombs, who understood their secrets, who knew how to enter without tripping the traps or disturbing the wrong spirits. And yet, even in violation, there was ritual. You pass a false door carved into the stone, its surface chipped, its glyphs smeared by human hands, unworthy of the space. It once served as a passageway for the K, the spirit essence of the deceased, a symbolic door through which offerings might be received. But now, it is scarred, it feels silenced, and in that silence, you hear the deeper tragedy, not just theft of gold, but theft of voice. Because to break a tomb was not only to remove its treasure, it was to rupture a sacred circuit. It was to interrupt the dialogue between soul and gods, between memory and eternity. A broken jar meant a broken organ. A missing amulet meant a missing protection. A stolen scroll meant the soul would wander the duat without its map. To rob the dead was to cast them adrift. And yet, paradoxically, this violation became a ritual in itself. There was a system to it, patterns, roles, timing. Sometimes, priests themselves would recover sacred objects and rebury them in secondary caches to protect them from state collapse or invasion. Other times, entire communities were involved. Mothers melting down jewelry, children unwrapping fragments of linen to retrieve oils or papyrus. These were not isolated acts. They were symptoms of a civilization crumbling under its own weight. caught between reverence and survival. You kneel beside a shattered alabaster bowl, its contents long gone, but its design still elegant, incised with the shape of a lotus, its petals curled outward in the eternal symbol of rebirth. The irony stings something once made to honor eternity now sits discarded, its cycle interrupted, but still there is beauty in it. Still, there is the outline of the original intention. And here is where the Egyptians differed from us yet again. They knew this could happen. They planned for it. In fact, many tombs included decoys, fake chambers filled with inferior goods, false sarcophagi, misleading passageways carved specifically to delay, distract, deceive. Some tombs even included curses, not the dramatic, Hollywood kind, but legal threats. Whoever disturbs this tomb will be brought before the Council of Osiris. Their name will be erased. And that was the worst fate imaginable, not death, but erasure. You rise and approach a niche where a single figurine stands untouched, surprisingly intact. It's a shabti, carved from faience, arms crossed, holding farming tools. These small figures were meant to come alive in the afterlife, performing labor on behalf of the deceased. The robbers must have missed it, or perhaps they left it deliberately, out of fear, or perhaps out of some complicated respect for the dead they were dismantling, because even in theft, there is hesitation. Even in desecration, there is doubt. You sit for a moment, and your thoughts begin to turn not toward blame, but toward paradox. What does it mean that the same civilization that built eternal tombs also produced those who broke them open? That the same hands which painted spells on walls might one day return to scrape them off? The Egyptians might say this is mad disrupted, cosmic order disturbed, but not destroyed, because every scar in this tomb becomes part of the story. Even the damage tells the truth that memory is fragile. That belief, once externalized in gold and pigment, can be torn apart. But what can't be taken so easily is intention, the will to preserve, the need to be remembered, the hope that even in the ruin, someone will come perhaps centuries later and see the outline of what once was sacred. And you are that person now. You are the one standing among the ruins, seeing not the theft, but the thread beneath it, the thread that links belief to loss, devotion to desecration, ritual to violation. You see that the tomb was built to last, but it was also built to be witnessed, even in pieces, even in aftermath. As you rise and prepare to leave the chamber, you glance once more at the walls, scratched, damaged, imperfect, and yet somehow still radiating a kind of soft power, not because they remain unbroken, but because they remain legible. The gods may refuse to forget, but so, too, do the walls. Even in violation, there is visibility. Even in theft, there is a second ritual. There is a different silence in this next chamber, not reverent, not engineered, but strained, as if the air itself has been holding its breath for too long. The torch you carry burns steadily, but its light seems thinner here, as if reluctant to settle on the walls. You pause, listening not with your ears, but with something deeper. The room is still, and yet it is not at rest. You are standing in a part of the tomb that was not meant to be entered again, not by the living, not by the priests, perhaps not even by the gods. This was the final room, the final seal, and yet something remains awake. The Egyptians had many words for soul: Ka, the life force; Ba, the personality; Ah, the transfigured spirit. And though they believed each part could move between worlds, they also knew the danger if something went wrong, a burial too rushed, a name mispronounced, a rite skipped. These were not small mistakes, they were cosmic ruptures. The soul could become confused, could become stuck, could grow bitter, could return, and so, here in this space, you feel not just the presence of the dead, you feel their unrest. The room itself is small, but the energy in it presses outward, bending time in strange ways. The sarcophagus is cracked, not from age, but from force. One corner of the lid has been pried up, not completely removed, but just enough to suggest an interruption, not curiosity, panic. Someone came back, or something tried to leave. You kneel beside it, and the stone beneath you is warm, too warm. It should not be, not at this depth, not after this long. But the air is tight, pulsing faintly, as if the very room had inhaled centuries ago and never exhaled. The Egyptians believed that if the proper rituals were not performed, the soul would not rest. The Ka might return to haunt the tomb. The Ba might circle endlessly, unable to leave the underworld. Worse still, the body itself could rise not in the fantastical sense of modern horror tales, but in a more terrifying way, a corpse that still needed, still hungered, still desired judgment that never came. You examine the wall to your right. It is scratched, not with symbols, not with chisels, but with fingernails. You count the marks, too many, not enough to form words, but enough to say, I was not done. You wonder, who was this person? Were they buried too soon? Was their name spoken without sincerity? Was their heart weighed and found heavy, and yet buried anyway in gold, dressed in the lie of righteousness, because the gods do not forget? But neither, sometimes, do the dead. The air turns colder now, not physically, but in presence. You feel watched, not by the gods above, but by something at eye level, something once human, perhaps still so, or perhaps less. You look to the far corner and find an object you nearly missed, a shattered mirror, polished copper. It once reflected the living. Now it shows nothing. You hold your torch to it, expecting your face, but see only a warped suggestion of light. The Egyptians believed mirrors could reflect the soul. To break one was not an accident. It was an act of desperation or defense. In this place, the rituals of mummification were precise for a reason. The dead had to be sealed, had to be convinced they were finished, had to be guided gently across the threshold, because if not, if the instructions were incomplete, or the soul unconvinced, it might linger, and those who lingered were not forgotten with ease. You turn slowly, taking in the walls. They are unusually bare. No prayers, no protective gods, just rough plaster and chipped pigment, as if whoever buried this person knew something had gone wrong and chose, instead, to walk away. There are tales buried deep in Egyptian texts, whispered in footnotes, and half-erased inscriptions of the Mut, the restless ones, corpses whose eyes never closed, whose mouths reopened weeks after burial, not reanimation in the modern sense, but refusal to accept death as it had been presented to them. They clawed, they moaned, they whispered in dreams, and the priests, when summoned, would not always return with prayer. Sometimes they brought fire, sometimes they brought silence, and sometimes they brought erasure, removing the name from every wall, from every scroll, so that even the soul itself would forget who it had been. You exhale slowly now, aware of how much breath you've been holding. A bead of sweat traces your spine, not from fear, but from the strange pressure of proximity. You are close now to something unsettled, not dangerous, perhaps, but wrong, incomplete. And yet, even in this, There is a lesson. Not all tombs succeed. Not all lives resolve cleanly. Some endings are messy. Some transitions fracture under their own weight. But the Egyptians didn't ignore these failures. They encoded them. Even in the stories of unrest, there is structure. There is truth. You step back toward the door. The air lightens slightly. The silence lifts. The presence dims. Perhaps whatever stirred here is tired, or maybe it knows you mean no harm. Before you leave, you whisper not in ritual language, not in sacred script, but in your own voice, soft, honest. I see you. I know something was left unfinished, but you are not alone, and you walk on, because the tomb is not only for the perfect, it is also for the broken. And even those who refuse to sleep are still remembered. The path ascends subtly beneath your feet, not in a triumphant climb, but in a movement so gentle it almost goes unnoticed, like breath returning to the chest after long stillness. The air becomes lighter, though not because it is fresher. There is no opening here, no breeze, no escape, but because something internal has shifted. You are not rising from a tomb. You are rising into its meaning. The walls around you have changed. Gone are the gods with heads of beasts, the scenes of divine judgment, the weight of ceremony etched in every line. Now the carvings are simpler, quieter. They depict no throne rooms, no feathers on scales, no divine interrogations. Instead, they show life not the grand versions, but the intimate ones. A woman grinding grain, a man fishing, children playing near a well. These are not images of the afterlife. These are fragments of the life that comes before it. And though the tomb itself belongs to someone long gone, it now turns toward you, not as a shrine, but as a mirror, because you will be buried too one day, not in linen, perhaps, not beneath stone, but no less surely. And though you came here to understand a culture foreign in time and belief, you leave this chamber feeling seen, in a way that is strangely familiar. The rituals you've witnessed so alien, so elaborate, so carefully drawn, begin to dissolve into a truth that is both universal and uncomfortably personal, that every life is already a preparation for death, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. You sit beside a mural that shows a man embracing another, their arms linked not in farewell, but in recognition. Their faces are aged, lined with tenderness and fatigue. One holds a water jug, the other kneels beside a fire. There is no gold in this scene, no magic, no divine audience, only care. The simplicity is disarming, and you realize that perhaps, in this space filled with maps of the afterlife and formulas for immortality, what matters most is the kindness shown when no one is watching. It occurs to you then that the real burial begins not with the tomb, but with the quiet choices made in life. The way you answer when your name is not being called, the way you treat others in the moments when nothing is owed and no reward is guaranteed. These are the acts that wrap around the soul far longer than linen. These are the spells that require no priest to recite, no resin to preserve, because they imprint themselves into the people who survive you. And so the question comes not shouted, not asked aloud, but pressed gently into your awareness by the stillness of the room itself when your name is spoken for the last time. What shape will it carry? You rise and place your hand on the wall. The carvings are shallow here, worn by time and air and quiet observation. They are not declarations, they are reminders. No matter how elaborate the burial, no matter how sacred the preparation, it is the memory left behind that endures. You recall the belief that a person dies 3 times once, when the heart stops, again when the body is lowered into the ground, and finally when their name is spoken for the last time. The first is inevitable, the second is ritual, but the third, perhaps that is where meaning lies. You begin to walk again, slowly, deliberately, and with each step, the tomb feels less like a relic and more like a teacher, not a voice of command, but of invitation, not preaching salvation, but pointing gently toward intention. In the fading light, you see a figure carved into the final archway, neither god nor royal, just a person, wrapped, arms crossed, features serene, and above their head is a phrase written in hieroglyphs that translates roughly as, "I lived gently, let me pass." That sentence stays with you, not because of its grandeur, but because of its restraint, because you understand now that death in ancient Egypt was not feared for its pain, but for its possibility of incompleteness. The rituals, the architecture, the judgment, all of it served to create continuity, to ensure that nothing was left unfinished, that even in silence, the dead would speak clearly through the shape of their lives. And so will you, one day, when your body is laid down by hands, familiar or unfamiliar, in a place known or nameless. The question will not be whether you believed in gods of falcon and flame, or whether your tomb was built of alabaster and gold. It will be whether you lived in a way that left no need for a mask to lie on your behalf, whether your soul, upon arrival at the final threshold, can speak its own name without fear, whether your memory, when wrapped around those who loved you, holds warmth instead of regret. You will be buried too, but perhaps, like those who came before you, the work of your afterlife begins now, and it begins with the way you choose to live before the linen ever touches your skin. The chamber that follows is unlike the others. There is no central figure, no sarcophagus, no shattered jars or murals in sequential lines. It is, at first glance, empty. But you understand by now that in Egypt, emptiness is never absence. It is space made ready, space carved for something less tangible than bone or linen. This room, circular in shape and smooth in design, exists for what cannot be wrapped, sealed, or buried. It is where the spirit lingers, not to haunt, but to echo. You step inside and find the walls bare of decoration, but covered in incised patterns, spirals, looping curves, nested ovals like ripples in water. They are not words. They are not symbols in the traditional sense. They are remnants of a different kind of language memory, transformed into design. These curves do not instruct, they remind, and what they remind you of is simple, yet vast, that what survives is not the flesh. Flesh was treated with great care, yes, preserved, perfumed, protected from time and decay, but never because it was the most important thing. It was the container, it was the context. What truly mattered was what passed through it, the name, the will, the web of relationships that tethered one person to the world and to the divine. And here, in this undecorated space, the tomb opens itself to that unseen continuity. You sit on the cool stone floor, cross-legged, back straight, breath slow. The walls do not speak, they reflect, and slowly, your mind returns to the long procession of rituals you've moved through: the draining, the drying, the binding, the weighing, the watching, the remembrance, all of it, though physical in nature, pointed towards something invisible. The flesh was honored, but not because it endured. It was honored because it didn't. It was the name that survived. The wren etched into walls, spoken over bread offerings, whispered in the mouths of grandchildren born centuries after the heart had stilled, and the name was not just a label. It was a container for every deed, every relationship, every promise made or broken. If the name survived, the person did. If it was forgotten, they dissolved into shadow. And so this space, though silent, feels saturated. Saturated with names, not shouted, not written, but hovering just beneath the surface of your thoughts. Each person buried here once had a name so vital that others carved it into stone, sang it during feasts, painted it beside stars. They believed that as long as a name lived, the dead could visit the world of the living. They could stand behind you at night, not to frighten, but to watch, to remember, to be remembered. You notice, to your left, a niche containing a small box, its edges worn, but its lid still intact. You open it gently. Inside are scraps papyrus fragments, with ink nearly erased, bits of linen darkened by time, and a single ring of faience etched with a name that once echoed through homes, temples, maybe even palaces. It means nothing to you in sound. You cannot pronounce it, but you feel its shape, the way it was formed by love and sorrow, triumph and error. That name once turned in mouths. It once stopped arguments. It once filled a room with joy, or fear, or memory. Now it rests and it endures. You place the lid back gently and look around the chamber again. You see now that the curves in the walls are not random. They begin near the floor and rise toward the ceiling, wrapping the room in concentric motion, a spiral, a slow ascent. The same shape water makes when stirred, the same path a soul might take when rising from the body, not in a straight line, but in widening memory, to be remembered not as a statue, but as a story, because stories survive longer than anything, longer than flesh, longer than even names. A name can be erased, a statue can crumble, but a story, passed from voice to voice, rebuilt from fragment and feeling, has no expiration. The story is the true sarcophagus, the final container. You think now of those you've loved, of those who have passed, and realize that what you hold of them is not their flesh, not their weight, their height, their features, but their rhythm, their inflections, their smallest gestures. You remember how they laughed, how they folded a towel, how they said goodbye without saying the word. These fragments of behavior outlast the body. They become the new wrapping, the new form, and so you understand. Seated in this round room, why the Egyptians obsessed over the rituals of preservation, not because they believed flesh would last forever, but because they hoped memory would. They gave the body a structure so the spirit might find its way back to the world, not to live again, but to be remembered correctly, truthfully, fully. You rise and place a hand on the curved wall. The stone is warm, not from heat, but from reverberation. Somewhere, someone still speaks a name once stored in this chamber, or maybe you're the first in centuries to whisper it again. Either way, the stone responds, not with movement, but with stillness so full, it becomes its own kind of answer. And as you step back toward the door, preparing to enter the final passage, you take with you this truth. The body may be laid in linen and gold, may be sealed with prayers, may be guarded by jackals and stars, but none of it matters more than the story someone chooses to tell in your name, because what survives is not the flesh. What survives is who you were when no one else was watching. The corridor that welcomes you now is neither grand nor narrow. It feels transitional, less a destination than a liminal space between breath and reflection. Your torch continues its slow dance along the stone, but you no longer need it to see. The images that guide you forward are internal now. You carry them, the smell of incense, the sound of silence, the weight of judgment, the warmth of hands once folded over the chest in prayer. You are no longer just observing the tomb. You are becoming a part of what it preserves, and what it preserves, above all else, is memory. This final chamber is not the most ornate. It does not boast towering statues or elaborate murals. Instead, its walls are lined with shelves, each one filled not with treasure, but with remnants, bundles of linen, fragments of scrolls, partial masks, name tablets worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. You walk past them not as an outsider, but as one who has learned their purpose. These are not leftovers. They are echoes, carefully curated echoes. You approach a shelf at eye level and find a shard of pottery, small enough to hold in your palm. Scratched into its surface is a name, not one you recognize, not one historians may remember, but someone's mother, someone's son, someone who once carried water, or read poetry, or whispered secrets before sleep. The shard may have broken, the tomb may have been breached, but the name remains, faint, persistent, alive in form, if not in voice. The Egyptians understood what even modern cultures struggle to accept, that memory is not static. It is not a preserved photograph or an unchanging archive. It is a living, breathing construct, fragile, shifting, sacred, and so they mummified not just the body, but the idea of a person. They wrapped it in layers of name, gesture, intention, and invocation. They created redundancies, names on walls, names in scrolls, names on amulets, names spoken during feasts, because memory, if tended to like flame, could burn eternal. You pass a narrow column, carved with the story of a scribe, not a royal, not a high priest, but a simple man whose life was etched here in brief. He copied prayers, corrected the mistakes of younger scribes, offered food to the poor from his monthly wages. No feats of war, no temple building, just a lifetime of alignment. His memory was mummified not in gold, but in words he once wrote for others that now carry his name forward like a candle down a long hallway. You sit near the center of the room, knees tucked beneath you, and let your eyes rest on the nearest wall. There's a mural here, though much of it has faded. You can make out figures seated, gesturing, their faces turned toward a central light. They are not grand, they are not crowned, but they are attentive, listening. And you realize this isn't a depiction of the dead being honored. It's a depiction of the living remembering them. The focus is not on those who have passed. It's on those who still speak their names. This room is not a tomb within a tomb. It is a memory chamber, a place where identity, fragmented by time, is given form again through remembrance. Each item here has no function except to continue the story. Each is a thread pulled from the past, waiting for someone in the future to hold it long enough to feel its warmth. And now it's your hand holding it, your eyes following the contours, your breath stirring the dust that once rose during rituals older than your oldest ancestor. You think again of those who prepared the dead, not as priests, but as guardians of memory. Their tools were physical, yes, resin, natron, linen, but their truest tool was continuity. They wrapped the flesh so tightly, not to protect muscle, but to cradle a story so that it would not unravel in the dark. And now you ask yourself, what will you leave behind? Not in wealth, not in lineage, but in resonance. What gestures, what phrases, what fragments of your own rhythm will others carry forward after your final breath is taken and your name is spoken for the last time in your presence? Will someone whisper your name in kindness? Will someone trace your story in the silence between sentences? Because the real mummification, the one that matters, has nothing to do with the wrapping of limbs or the drying of organs. It has everything to do with the shape your memory takes in the world that continues after you, and how that shape, whether crisp or crumbling, might still offer warmth to someone walking through darkness centuries later. You rise one last time and look back over the chamber, and you know nothing here is gone. Everything remains, because everything, if remembered with care, can be mummified not in linen, but in love. And now the tomb exhales. You step quietly back from its chambers, each one having folded itself behind you like the closing of a book, not with finality, but with fulfillment. The air feels lighter, yet not empty. It carries something now, a weightless kind of knowing, not heavy with sorrow or fear, but thick with reverence, with the slow sediment of meaning that settles when a story has been fully told. You do not feel like someone who merely observed the rituals of a foreign time. You feel like someone who has walked beside them, carried water for them, helped wrap the final layer of linen around someone who once mattered and still does. You understand, now more than ever, that the ancient Egyptians did not build tombs to resist death, but to reframe it, to soften it, to give it structure so that memory would not dissolve into nothingness. They accepted decay, but refused disappearance. They let the flesh go, but fought to keep the story, and that fight continues in all of us. Every moment of care, every goodbye spoken with trembling voice, every photograph held too long in your hands, every joke repeated in someone's absence, it's all a ritual, a small preservation, a private mummification of someone whose spirit still has weight in your world. And one day, someone will do the same for you, not with bandages or jars, but with stories, with glances, with quiet acts of continuation. So let this hour you've spent inside the tomb be a gift you carry forward, not as history, but as an invitation. Live gently, speak names, wrap memory with kindness. Let the dust settle, and trust that the love you give now will linger far longer than the body ever could. Please, if this story held meaning for you, consider sharing it gently with someone you love, someone whose name you want to echo long after today is done.